Hi, so just a brief introduction to the notion of the Gilded Age. Now, the Gilded Age is actually the title of a book that was written by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner. Right? His name sounds like deadly warning. And in a sense, the book was a kind of deadly warning about what could come from American prosperity. So it's a label that was put on the last 3 decades of the 19th century, right? A time of immense prosperity in America. You could say that it saw the rise of the USA, to become the first major world power, especially later on after the First World War. America actually got rich during the First World War, while Europe got impoverished. So this period, the Gilded Age, the last 3 decades of the 19th century, you could say it started after Reconstruction, right? The Reconstruction era, which is when America, especially the South, was reconstructed after the American Civil War, right? Which ended in 1865. Reconstruction was, as you probably know, a partial failure, since the South established segregation laws and didn't reconstruct any sort of decent life for African Americans. And the Gilded Age saw, some prosperity for African Americans compared to what it was like under slavery, obviously. But often the workers were forced in some parts of the South to work for their former slave owners as, paid slaves, basically. So that didn't lead to much prosperity there. But a lot of African Americans moved north and moved into slightly better jobs. The pay was better in the north. And the pay in America in general was much higher than in Europe, right? Wages were much higher and they rose continuously, up to by 60% in that period of the Gilded Age. So it was a time of great prosperity, as I said. You had the robber barons who became immensely rich on in the industries of, say, meat, gold, things like steel, the steel industry, or the financial sector, and they became so immensely rich that they were called the robber barons. Now, the robber barons, the main ones that are usually referred to are, say, Andrew Carnegie or Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt. You have a few called, Frick and Stanford. But so they're the main ones, and they grew immensely rich by giving the poor relatively low wages. Even though they were higher than in Europe, they were still pretty low. And now some of these robber barons later donated their wealth. Right, so they got rich off the back of the poor, and then they actually donated their 90% of their wealth in the case of Andrew Carnegie. Not so much back to the poor entirely, but back to the people, right? By building institutions, Carnegie Hall, for example, the famous musical academy, concert venue. Was built by him, things like that. So he gave money back. So did Rockefeller, 50% of his wealth. Right? They were in competition at some point, but Carnegie won when he gave the full 90% of his wealth back. So they did have some conscience. It came belatedly, but it did come in the end. And Andrew Carnegie actually called this the gospel of wealth. This idea that there was something almost religious about the acquiring of money, and that it should be also redistributed to the poor. Right. So this phrase, the gospel of wealth, was actually taken from a book that he wrote about that subject. So in many ways it was a time of prosperity. Now, why Twain and Warner called it the Gilded Age rather than the Golden Age is that it was in a sense gilded, right? Just gold plated rather than made of massive gold. Since there were huge disparities between the rich and the poor, and they grew during that time and have grown ever since, you could say. So there was, in a sense, a kind of covering, a varnish of gold over terrible, the terrible plight of the underprivileged and the impoverished. And also, there is the sense in that book that America is trading its soul, in a sense, for material prosperity and neglecting spiritual wealth. You could say that Carnegie brought the two together in his book, The Gospel of Wealth, both spiritual wealth and financial wealth. But on the whole, there was a tendency in America to favor material gain over any sort of spiritual prosperity, you could say. Now, this was encouraged also by the Transcontinental Railroad. America developed its railroad system, its network, during the Civil War. That did help the North a lot, but mostly after the Civil War during the Gilded Age. And when it used to take 6 months to travel from New York to San Francisco, thanks to the railroad, it took 6 days. So you can imagine how many people just flocked, west to go and discover the far west and enjoy prosperity there. And generally speaking, everything became highly industrialized. You could say the Industrial Revolution really got going during the Gilded Age. So you had more efficiency in industry, also thanks to Taylorism, the notion of efficiency movement that was studied by Taylor, really made industries more efficient. So on the whole, it wasn't much of a reformist era. A little bit. There were some reforms, most notably the suffragette movement really got going during the Gilded Age, but it was only in 1920 that women got the vote in America. It was one of the first countries in the world, but still it took a while after the Gilded Age to achieve that. The temperance movement also did achieve some success, and again, it was only in the 1920s that the temperance movement actually came to fruition under the banning of alcohol. So, on the whole, it wasn't a time of reform. It's more the era that came after that, the progressive era, that saw a notable increase in social reforms.